Well, colleagues, well, first of all, thank you very much, Patricia, for this presentation. There was a hidden agenda in including this particular presentation on the program. I didn't tell her why this was included. Neither did I contribute to deciding on the topic that she will talk about. But if you look back, we've been talking about community and public engagement. And if you pay attention carefully, there is innovation, lots of innovation in how you engage the public. And so I thought that this could give us learning and thinking deeply about how we engage the public. So just a comment. Thank you very much for the presentation.
What Professor Sumakombo didn't tell you was he called me to his office and said, I have a question for you, but you can't say no. And since he's known me for 27 years, I was like, okay. But I'm delighted to be here.
Thank you so much, Dr. Patricia, for the very emotional presentation. My question is probably, I wanted to know, now, what is the end point in the Truth and Reconciliation in Canada for an indigenous person, let's say, in Saskatchewan or Saskatoon? What would be the end point of that indigenous person, let's say, in the next 10, 25 years? What do we expect to be the outcome of these indigenous people? Thank you so much.
That's a very good question. Young people now discuss the fact that they'll be over it when they don't have to talk about the term residential school anymore. That they won't have to, you know, see different family members die from drug overdose, for example, from the intergenerational impact of the schools. For non-Indigenous people, it's been an eye-opener. For many, because the schools were far from schools where they attended, a lot of Canadians were just ignorant about what had happened. And as I mentioned, there's still a lot we don't know, and there's still a lot that hasn't been released from the archives. But I think in the last week there was a report that was leaked to the press in Canada about the murdered missing women, murdered missing Indigenous women. There are over 4,000 women who I think have died in the span of maybe 20 years. And certainly policing and the justice system haven't been accountable to their deaths. So I think it's going to define us for a long time. And it's also interesting in preschool and in kindergarten, that is now when children are learning about the impact of residential school. It's coming into their little books, and Indigenous child stories are being incorporated into mass education essentially. Did that help?
Yeah.
Patricia, I was wondering, I mean, in line with this question, because I think the lady had a very similar question, it seems, whether it is truth and reconciliation. I mean, to my knowledge, the one I was exposed to is the South African truth and reconciliation. It didn't really speak necessarily about the HIV epidemic, although you might think that, well, there may well be links, and maybe racial Jews did that. But can you learn, so your new work, which is this sort of comparative analysis, can one learn from one process to the other, you think, very usefully, so that outcomes from the first generation of truth and reconciliation experiences is passed on to the next one in a positive way?
I think definitely. The one really great thing after the Truth and Reconciliation report was released it had a list of recommendations for healthcare and healthcare providers. And certainly one recommendation was, let's get more Indigenous people into medical school. Let's get more Indigenous people into universities. Way back in the day, if you wanted to go to law school, if you wanted to go to be a teacher, if you wanted to be a doctor, you had to give up your Indian identity. So you gave up your status. So essentially, many people didn't go to university or post-secondary education because of that law. So a lot of what's happening in Canada now is that research-oriented universities are really jockeying for position to be held accountable to the recommendations of the TRC. And just before I left, we had a meeting with guys from Queensland University, and they, you know, haven't had. I think they've had an apology, but not a TRC. And what was interesting to me, though, was that the president of Queensland University came for Indigenous issues, and that I don't think probably has ever happened at that school before. So they're intensely interested. So while nothing has been made into law, the report itself is making significant differences now.
Thank you very much. You have more questions? Just a little note about every speaker has given their presentation. Just make sure you have.
That was a very interesting, very moving presentation. Thank you very much. I was wondering what happens in small communities. There must be much smaller places than Vancouver which have got Indigenous populations. Are there any sort of support programs, or is the Truth and Reconciliation program reaching people in those communities?
Yes. In Vancouver, or in BC, a number of years ago, probably 5, 6, 7 years ago, the federal government decided to devolve healthcare to the province for First Nations people. So now there's a First Nations Health Authority. The problem that's happening right now is that those funds that are transferred from the federal government to the First Nations Health Authority have to be used on reserve. And in Vancouver, you know, the majority of BC First Nations people actually live in urban lives. And so right now, there's a lot of work being done to figure out, okay, so these funds are allocated for reserve. How do we fund these healing initiatives with the same bunch of funds? They can do it. It's just a struggle, because we've seen them do it before. There's lots of jurisdictional issues in healthcare in BC related to First Nations.
Thank you, Patricia, for that very, very illuminating and emotional presentation. My question was related to my colleague's question, but in answering his question, you mentioned the word archives. Most of the information is archived. And I have had a similar thing from my own daughter, who is a historian, trying to work. I'm a Kenyan, and she's working on MESAU-MEPI.
Oh, interesting.
So she's been making trips. Okay, I shouldn't be talking about my daughter because I just want to talk about the archives.
Yeah.
But what I've heard her say is it's so difficult to really unearth all the atrocities that the colonial government inflicted on the Kenyans during the MESAU-MEPI movement. Because most of the information is archived, and there are regulations that say you cannot release it until so many years from now. So we go back to the same thing in your studies with the indigenous populations in Vancouver. How can we aspire to have truth and reconciliation when we know, or when you go back and give your feedback, and they get to understand that because some of the information is archived, there's still some information that we don't have. So in my view, we cannot get to the bottom of the truth and get to complete healing if even now, so many years, much later, the persons who inflicted or who perpetrated those atrocities still do not want to let us have all the information. So that you can hide that information the healing once and for all. So
it's a very, very prescient point, because for many indigenous people that I work with, they're kind of like, we gotta know the truth first, and the depth of the truth. And still there is a lot of mistrust between indigenous peoples in Canada, the government and the justice system. I have a colleague who wrote the story of the nutritional experiments that occurred in the schools around 1945. So before the Belmont Report, and before we understood how research ethics came to be. One of my colleagues' mom always wore dentures, and she didn't understand why. It was just something she just knew, that she always had false teeth. But her mom was actually a part of those nutritional experiments where they were deprived of milk, vitamin A, and many other things. And so I think as things become uncovered, including excavations, there are a lot of, there's a nation in the East which is hiring their own archaeological research firm, it's not government guys, to excavate around the school, because they think that there are more skeletons, more remains around the school than they actually think. I have one of the members on our governance, her name is Violet Bizoki, and she's been a very active elder working with us. When she was at residential school, one of the guys got her friend pregnant. And when she was looking out the window one day, the priest and the nun were suffocating her friend to death. So there was, because she was pregnant. And so there's a lot hidden and a lot that's not told. So it's a very, very hidden part of Canadian reality, but we are slowly uncovering portions of the truth. My colleague who's currently working in the archives, he kind of keeps it down low. I suspect that it's the Canadian archives in Britain. Yeah. He likes to keep a low profile because he needs to continue to get access. So when he was doing the archival work, he just ran into, serendipitously, this nutritional experiment piece. But what now that he is working on now is that pharma was also involved in experimentation with indigenous families, which is a thing I think that is even here in East Africa as well.
Okay, I allow a very, very short last question because we need to move on with the program. And maybe a short answer too.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you for giving me the opportunity. As somebody who has been in Gulu for over 15 years, I think I witnessed some of the things which happened, the atrocities firsthand. Yeah, there was a lot that happened at the study like that. She was a very good one as far as the healing process, or the beginning of the healing process was concerned. Not only the traumatic aspect of it, but the consequences of the war. Now, look at that title, Changolage, which, yeah, you rightly defined it, healing the elephant. And in the Choli culture, as we know, when you talk about the elephant, you're actually talking about the Choli totality. As far as research is concerned, somebody will look at it and then have a different interpretation. But to, the indigenous people, the interpretation will go way beyond, the research component. So I'm wondering, as part of your study, was there a care or support component to it? Because certainly, to actually reading that, or the community looking at that title, they will begin asking a lot of questions. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, I think, and that's a very good one. And it was certainly a great wrestle in terms of whether that title would work. One piece that I didn't get to talk to you about was, the role of your YO, your paternal auntie. One really cool study that we did some time back was use those beautiful Acholi child protection mechanisms to create culturally safe spaces for girls in the camps, and then move those understandings into programming. So my hope is, in the next 7 years that we have, is to focus on bringing up more of those traditional child protection mechanisms, make them trauma-informed and culturally safe, but enhance them by using technology. And so that's part of our future, is doing important work that's really rooted in Acholi tradition and culture.
Okay, I think the very last final word is Professor Nelson.
Yes, a short one. Where you ended your presentation, you said that we are exploring how to do this dissemination of our results. Dissemination in such a way that it is done within the actual culture. That people do dissemination, we all do dissemination, and we know the standard way of doing dissemination. But here, you want to embed it in the actual culture. To me, that is interesting, because again, it shows some degree of innovation in how you do dissemination, and that would be relevant to our people. So, can you say a little more about that?
Well, we're just beginning those conversations. I think, as you know, as people were coming out of the bush, the real focus was on Matuput. However, I think from the intense qualitative research that we did, we identified many other mechanisms that might work well, whether coming of age or naming ceremonies. Those are pieces that we still have yet to explore.
Okay, wonderful.
Thank you.